I mean, I always look forward to being in critical dialogue with my dear brother Simon Critchley. We started years ago at the new school. We were there last year again in the snow with James Miller and the others. We're in Brooklyn this year, and next year look for us maybe in the Bronx. We just don't know. But we're going to sustain this philosophical and political engagement, not only because we love the subject matter, but also because we love each other. Simon Critchley is one of those philosophers whose work I read regularly and religiously. You come across an author, it could be Eric Auerbach in literary criticism, or M.H. Abrams, or Harold Bloom, or Edward Said. It could be Muriel Rukeyser's poetry. It could be Toni Morrison's novels. You choose certain figures to say you're going to read everything they produce. Why? Because it allows you to undergo your endless paideia, that deep education that forces you to wrestle with your soul, to engage in that kind of soul turning that Plato talks about in the middle of the book, in the middle of the Republic. It's a way in which everything is at stake in what they are writing. So it's not academic in the worst sense. It's intellectual in the best sense. And what I love about Simon Critchley is he does, in fact, take very seriously my two primary traditions, which is the Socratic legacy of Athens and the prophetic legacy of Jerusalem, and he dips it in those who are attempting to struggle against, resist, be resilient in the face of structures of domination and various forms of oppression, which is to say, what is so rare, and this is what separates certain thinkers. He begins with the catastrophic. Like Benjamin, like Du Bois, like Kafka, the first line of the Metamorphosis, catastrophic, transformed into a huge, vicious, ugly vermin. But usually, philosophers, critics are so deodorized, they don't want to deal with that kind of funk. They want to stay on the surface, maybe get to the problematic. No, we begin with the catastrophic, which is very different than just the problematic. And that's one of the reasons why his response to the starting point of most of the kinds of philosophers who I tend to be attracted to. They begin with line 607b of Book 10 of Plato's Republic, the traditional quarrel between poetry and philosophy. And he decides to engage in a form of philosophizing that goes to school with the poets. Because usually it's the poets. And by poets, I include musicians. Beethoven called himself a poet of tones. John Coltrane is a poet of sound. So we're including poets in the broader sense, the way Shelley understood it in that last line of the 1821 pamphlet, Defense of Poetry. Poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. And he wasn't just talking about versifiers. All human beings who muster the courage to have imagination, to conceive of a different world and use bits of this world to attempt to transform the present world into something in light of that world you imagine. So it's a primacy of empathy and imagination in that sense. And this is very rare because most of our philosophers since Descartes have gone to school with science and mathematics. It's the difference between Vico and Descartes. Vico begins with corpses, humando, where our word humanity and humility come from. What does it mean to be human? Burying, that's what humando means in the Latin. You begin with the corpses, which is even more concrete than Heidegger's beginning with death. Death is too abstract for a brother like me. I'm with Bootsy Collins and George Clinton. I begin with the funk. And corpses stink. But there's also deep love and freedom in that funk. We'll get to that later. Or really quicker than I think, because I'm not going to speak too long when the mate's going to. But the important thing is this meta-philosophical point. Simon Critchley can be talking about Derrida. He can be talking about Merleau-Ponty, he can be talking about Heidegger, he can be talking about Rousseau, and this text is full of some of the most wonderful, close readings of Rousseau's Social Contract and its juxtaposition with the Geneva manuscript, the first version of that work of 1762. And close readings of Being in Time, Heidegger's classic of 1927. Very close readings of Badiou and a Joe Frazier, Muhammad Ali-like slug 'em out with Zizek. In that last chapter, you all are slugging it out. And he's Joe Frazier in the first match. This brother wins. And I don't think Zizek's coming back, actually, the way Muhammad Ali did. But it's an intellectual kind of engagement in that regard. But beginning with the metaphysical point of going to school with the poets, which means going to school with history, memory, story, narrative, metaphors, metonymies, synecdoches, those things we human beings mobilize in our move from mother's womb to tomb, which means it is existential. Everything is at stake: life, death, sadness, sorrow, joy, pleasure, and love. Echoes of Plato's definition of philosophy. Philosophia, love of wisdom, is a meditation on and preparation for death. But not just death as a physical event, but, as Montaigne says, to philosophize is to learn how to die, which means mustering the courage to critically examine yourself. So when you let a certain assumption go, that's a form of death, and there is no rebirth without death. You must learn to die if you're going to undergo paideia, if you're going to undergo deep education as opposed to cheap schooling, which is on the market model, which is predominant more and more these days. A lot of cheap schooling going on, skills, truncated knowledge, as opposed to life transformation, profound wisdom. That's why I believe in the Sankofa bird. You don't move forward unless you look back first and see the best. In that sense, he's the best of a subversive traditionalist or a traditional subversive, because he's in conversation with the best of those because of the centrality of memory and history. So he believes in radical historicity, the fixed circumstantiality of each and every one of us, born in circumstances not of our own choosing. Heidegger's notion of thrownness, the nullity of thrownness. We find ourselves thrown in the world through our mother's womb, love push that got us out, and our bodies will be the culinary delight of terrestrial worms one day, soon. That's a certain kind of thrownness too, and the worms appreciate it. Unless you're out for cremation. So that's the wrestling of what it means to be human. But this radical historicity is tied to a radical humility, back to the humando of Vico. A radical humility, that's very, very rare. And not just intellectual discourse, but philosophic discourse. That's why Chekhov hated philosophers. He says in one of his famous letters, you see, all these philosophers are like generals. They want to enlist you in their army. They're not interested in truth. They're interested in victory. They want you to join their school. Be a Platonist. Be an Aristotelian. Be an Epicurean. Be a Stoic. Be a Hegelian. Be a Marxist. Be a Whiteheadian. How narrow. Plato was not a Platonist. Read the dialogues. Aristotle was not an Aristotelian. That's for the epigons. That's for those who come after, in the same way that Jesus was not a Christian, but we get into that a little later. He was a Jewish brother, right? Like Hillel and a whole lot of other Jewish brothers. But the idea of being free, to learn how to die is to unlearn slavery. That's what Seneca says, and we don't expect too much profanity from the Romans. They're so busy conquering the world rather than understanding it. But Seneca was in conversation with the best of those who came before as well. So that radical historicity, grounded in history, but tied not just to context, but to catastrophe. The reality one cannot not know. The kind of suffering that the Graham family's going through right now with the police shooting that brother in his chest. That's the reality you cannot not know. You feel it at the visceral level. You feel it at the raw level. And the ways in which these various forms of suffering, be it psychic, be it political, be it economic, affect each and every one of us in our short trek from mama's womb to tomb. That's Simon Critchley. That's why he's my kind of philosopher. That way. It's radical humility. Now, when it comes to religion, even though we may disagree on the God question, he's such a soulmate, though you are. You really are, because in wrestling with death and learning how to die, and then therefore wrestling with life, it reminds me of the great George Santayana and his definition of religion in that 1913 classic of his, Winds of Doctrine. He said, religion is the love of life in the consciousness of impotence. Religion is the love of life in the consciousness of impotence. And in some ways, he was building on probably the greatest set of lectures ever given on religion as an existential phenomenon, not so much as a sociological phenomenon. This is the great William James, of course, in the Gifford Lectures, and the varieties of religious experience. At the very end of those lectures in Edinburgh, he says, now I come to the core of the religious problem. You can imagine folk calling in the back, what is it, James? What is it? He said, help, exclamation point. Help, exclamation point. That's the core of it. The call for help. And you get the literary rendition and depiction of this in the second greatest comic work ever written in American civilization, named Nathaniel West's great work, Miss Lonely Hearts. Of course, the first is Mark Twain, Huckleberry Finn, but number two is old brother Nathan Weinstein, who renamed himself Nathaniel West. So he's not my cousin, not related to me, but he is my soulmate. And in that first chapter, Mrs. Lonely Hearts, help, a direct, conscious, deliberate interpretation and appropriation of James's Gifford Lectures. Because Mrs. Lonely Heart is what? A Christ figure, a pseudo-Christ figure. For some, an anti-Christ figure, but somebody who looking for some external authority in order to gain some help. And what I love about Simon Critchley, and this is very different with my dear brother, the late Christopher Hitchens, who I love very much and respected very much. I just had profound disagreements. Christopher Hitchens was very brilliant, but he was not religiously musical. He was tone deaf and flat-footed when it came to religion. So he's a reductionist. He becomes a kind of dogma in atheistic space, a secular dogmatist. Just like religious folk have to be secularly musical to be able to read atheistic and agnostic texts with great empathy and openness. That secular folk need to read religious texts, and religious phenomena was a sense not just of openness, but what they are wrestling with. How are you going to come to terms with the structure of meaning in your own life, the structure of feeling in your own life? How are you going to deal with catastrophe in your own context, individual as well as collective? How will you respond when you're terrorized, traumatized, stigmatized, and so forth and so on? All of us have to come to terms with those questions, whatever narratives we mobilize. They can be secular narratives, they can be religious narratives, whatever. And in a certain sense, that's all we have, are just these stories and these narratives. And Simon Critchley is very, very sensitive to the ways in which these narratives can be mobilized. That's why he can end with such a magnificent reading of Kierkegaard's 1847 text, Works of Love. You say, oh, well, Simon, he's a deep, not just a Christian, he's a Christocentric radical. He's so obsessed with that first century Palestinian Jew named Jesus, he doesn't even conceive of any alternatives for him. And here comes secular Simon Critchley. Watch me appropriate this Danish Christian. Watch me give a reading of love. Why? Because I'm on the love train too. I don't need to have a cognitive commitment to God talk to be on the love train and to learn much from this deeply Christocentric Danish Christian, a poet and thinker, because that's really what Kierkegaard is. He's not even a theologian. He's first and foremost a poet and a thinker. He's trying to think poetically. And he ends up philosophizing and theologizing, but first and foremost, it's a matter of trying to mobilize certain kinds of metaphors in order to make sense. It constitutes his weaponry, as it were, echoes of the 6th chapter of Ephesians, putting on the whole armor, as it were, in his context. This radical historicity, radical humility, and then tied to radical democracy. This mystical anarchism. I do want you to say more words to our brothers and sisters of all colors here about what you mean by mystical anarchism. Because I like your radical democracy. I view the mystical anarchism as a kind of radical democracy. That's why so many of your writings resonate so deeply with the Occupy movement. Radical participatory democracy, suspicious of all forms of centralized power, whether it's in the public sphere, government, often unaccountable, FBI, CIAs, military-industrial complex, drones dropping bombs on innocent people and acting as if we ought not to have accountability and transparency and answerability, just keeping it always under the cover. Something we can learn from our anarchic brothers and sisters. Deep suspicions of centralized power in the public sphere, the kind of thing that G.K. Chesterton in his own quasi-anarchic distributed this way, always suspicious of government in that sense. But of course also highly suspicious of centralized power in the private sector, monopolies, oligopolies. You see, oligarchs, plutocrats at the top. And it's fascinating reading on the plutocratic condition of the United States in light of his defense of using Judith Butler's notion of nonviolent violence in that way. And you are right. I noticed that shift. It reminded me in some ways of the conversation that I've had with my dear brother Martin Luther King Jr. because he's a radical pacifist. I recall spending many, many nights with my dear brother Desmond Tutu in Cape Town. He's a radical pacifist too. And I say to them, Martin, of course, not directly. I speak to him every other night, but he doesn't show up physically. But he's there. Tutu I can call on the phone and say, I'm not an absolute pacifist. I'm not a radical pacifist. I am like Brother Simon Critchley. I pursue all forms of nonviolent strategies and tactics in order to ensure that the wretched of the earth have their humanity affirmed and to assure that they can live lives of decency and dignity. But I also believe that there are moments in which, circumstances under which violence is inescapable as a response to violence. It could be against Hitler. It could be Spear of the Nation against apartheid in South Africa. It could be in the United States 5, 10 years from now, the right wing fundamentally takes over, tries to chase me and Brother Carl Dix, not just in jail, but keep us in there. I'm coming out swinging, just like you, brother. I know you're doing it for communist reasons. I got Christian reasons, but the swing got the same rhythm. Simon would be swinging now. He wouldn't necessarily be swinging before, but he's swinging now, and that's real. Let me end this. 3 questions. 1, I want him to say a bit more about the role of poetry, because he spends a lot of time talking about fictions, supreme fictions that he gets from the great Wallace Stevens, who of course was a student of George Santayana too. And say more about how we can use fictions and actually believe in them to a certain degree, but be used in such a way that allows us to distinguish between a dead faith and a live faith. Or what John Henry Newman in the Grammar of Assent calls a assent as opposed to a real assent. Not just assenting to propositions, but a real assent in which you're willing to live and die for something. Very few of us willing to live and die for a proposition. For mama, yes. For a cause that seizes your soul, yes. That is what a live faith is. And that's one of the reasons why when you go to school with poetry, you're already then pushed to the brink, life's abyss, and willing to make some kind of leap of faith, because there's a fiducial constitution of existence. All of us have some element of faith, whether we're religious or not, because there's some role of trust, some role of loyalty. All these are notions tied to serious talk about the fiduciary element in experience. Think of Michael Polanyi's great work on personal knowledge in this regard. There's no escape in that regard. So it's not just a matter of religious faith. And even in the biblical text, you turn to Luke 18:8, where Jesus says, when the Son of Man returns, will he find faith on earth of any kind? Of any kind, not just religious faith. Because once you get the breakdown of faith, breakdown of trust, breakdown of loyalty, what do you have? Deception's hegemonic. Right? Deceit, hegemonic. Distrust, hegemonic. You can't survive. That's catastrophe on steroids. That's fascism so hegemonic, we can't even conceive of it unless we have examples. It could be Stalinism, it could be Nazism, it could be vicious forms of imperialism in the third world in the early part of the 20th century. But those are the kinds of challenges. So the first question has to do with poetry, the second has to do with mystical anarchism, as it were. And the last question has to do with the ways in which your notion of, my notion of radical democracy that I'm in some sense imposing upon you, but I view again your conception of mystical anarchism as a species of radical democracy. Everyday people, in the language of Sly Stone, having their voices heard in decision-making processes in institutions that guide and regulate their lives. Radical democracy, an autonomy against the state not imposing its will or the market imposing its will. But then the question becomes, what is the relation between radical democracy and radical love in a bit more detail? Because this text is distinctive in your corpus that I've enjoyed over the decades, being so explicit about this radical love. And, I could be on a personal tip with Sister Jameson Webster, because he's got a wonderful companion and things. I don't want to reduce this to biography, but if we're going stoicize, we got to include folk in your life who gives you some sense of love, and the ways in which this is now becoming more and more pronounced, as it were. I know both of you all are writing a book now on Hamlet. And what is distinctive about Hamlet? He's not just the greatest literary protagonist in modern literature, but he suffers from the incapacity to love, which is Dostoevsky's definition of hell. All those who suffer from the incapacity to love are living in hell. That's Fyodor. That's Dostoevsky. Fascinating formulation. Hamlet, you ought to be ashamed what you did to Ophelia. Hamlet, so philosophically sophisticated. Hamlet, so existentially committed to what? Others, love of neighbor, oh, legacy of Jerusalem. No, not filtering through that particular character. No, not a whole lot of hesed there, that Jewish gift to the modern world of conceiving of yourself as a human being who spreads hesed to orphan and widow and fatherless and motherless and weak and vulnerable. The prophetic tradition that comes out of the best of Hebrew scripture. Hamlet is not connected to that at all. So that relation of radical love to radical democracy, is it true that the deepening of your understanding of radical democracy pushes you to want to accent much more what we call this prophetic tradition, and therefore you end up talking so much about works of love filtered through Jesus of Nazareth, the Christ of faith, in that last wonderful chapter. But thanks so much for this wonderful book.